Been talking about this past week, keeping the focus on this issue of voter fraud. Apparently, he intends to ask congressional leaders to conduct their own investigations. The top Republicans tell us they have no intention of doing that. Interesting to watch President Trump come off Marine One as he's walking to what is now his new ride, the VC-25s that Mark Rosenker knows very much about, Air Force One. His staff tweeted a picture of themselves on the tarmac at Andrews, the Joint Base Andrews today, signaling that Trump Force One has been retired, and now President Trump is about to enjoy his first flight on the presidential aircraft for the first time.
Mark, I'm curious, because you have a history with these planes. Is it customary for presidents to customize Air Force One? As we just mentioned, Donald Trump already had a fleet of his own personal airplanes, and I'm wondering if incoming presidents sort of tweak or change Air Force One at all.
If they do that, it's very, very minor. Pictures, of course, which are hung on the walls that come from the new president's photographer. Some presidents put in a humidor for cigars, but very little actually changes from president to president as it relates to the interior.
And Stephen, we just saw the president boarding Air Force One. One of the things that I was looking for is a story that I remember somebody telling me when I was much younger about Ronald Reagan and a discussion that he had once with former President Bill Clinton. And former President Clinton asked him if he had any advice. And President Reagan said, when you salute when you board on Air Force One, make sure it's nice and crisp. There we saw Donald Trump saluting, I think, for the first time, because this is his first time on Air Force One. One thing he didn't do, Stephen, which I noticed, is generally, not always, but sometimes the president will turn around and wave for the cameras. Mr. Trump is just boarding and heading straight to the back of the plane.
Crowd here. I will note that this is now the second time that Donald Trump has flown on a military plane in the last week. He came down from New York last week on a different Air Force jet, what is the equivalent of a 757, and that was provided to him by President Obama so that he could come to D.C. as per tradition. Donald Trump understands how to give a salute. Remember, as a high schooler, he went to a military boarding school, the New York Military Academy. And so we saw that sharp salute that the president gave as he walked up the red carpeted steps to the presidential aircraft. He's heading to Philadelphia. This is an opportunity for him to meet with the rank-and-file Republicans in the House and Senate. We heard this morning from Speaker Ryan and from Majority Leader McConnell that they're on the same page as the White House and very excited to work on what they called their big, bold agenda in a unified Republican government. But there are some very critical questions that they have to answer about exactly how they would replace the Affordable Care Act, exactly where they stand on tax reform and all the complications that are involved in it and all the time it'll take to pass it. Plus, President Trump is set to ask Congress to pass a supplemental spending measure to pay for the wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. And the Republican leaders in Philadelphia said this morning that they're looking at a $12 to $15 billion cost. They didn't seem to shirk from it. They said they're willing to move forward with a $12 to $15 billion spending measure. What they haven't said is whether they'll look for cuts elsewhere in the budget to offset that cost.
One of the things, Stephen, sorry, go ahead, Amy.
Well, I was just curious about just how these meetings work, just how much access the lawmakers will have to the president and vice president. Do they huddle down with mainly only with the leaders, or do they meet with separate committees? How are they going to be able to sort of express their point of views directly to the president? This
retreat in Philly has been going on for a couple of days at a hotel downtown, and what President Trump will have is about 2 hours in Philly with the House and Senate Republicans. He will speak to them. He will have a Q&A with them. Now, the Q&A portion is closed to cameras and press, so we won't know per se until it ends exactly what goes on. But there will be an opportunity for cameras to capture President Trump talking to the Republicans about his agenda. Obviously, they'll hope to shape his agenda, and he'll hope to shape their agenda. But again, the Republican leadership is saying they speak they're on the same page on some of these critical questions. Speaker Ryan was asked this morning about how it's going to be to have to respond to the president's various interests, whims, tweets, and Speaker Ryan said, I think we're going to see some unconventional activities from an unconventional president. We're just going to have to get used to it.
Stephen, I want to also ask you, before I bring Mark back into the discussion, about the tweets that Mr. Trump tweeted earlier today at one point with regards to the meeting and the visit by the Mexican president. Yesterday, the Mexican president in a press conference saying that Mexico will not pay for this wall. The president then tweeting that perhaps the meeting should be canceled. Our Margaret Brennan, who covers the State Department, has said as of now the meeting is still going, and this was a couple of hours ago. I don't know if you've heard anything differently, but that does put the president and the president of Mexico in a very tough spot.
No question about it. I mean, one of the things that President Trump mentioned in his tweet this morning is the roughly $60 billion trade deficit that America has with its neighbor to the south. So we sell, or rather we buy about $59 billion more in goods each year than we sell to Mexico. And the president said in his tweet that leads to a massive loss of jobs. And he wants to renegotiate NAFTA. Well, the concern south of the border is that if you renegotiate NAFTA and you make life harder or you make the Mexican economy less favorable, you could make life harder for Mexicans. And in that circumstance, perhaps it'll be a larger push or a magnet northward by Mexicans who seek to move into this country. The Mexican government says that there's essentially a net zero migration from Mexico proper to the United States. Now, they admit that there's a problem further south with Central Americans coming up through Mexico, but they say that Mexicans themselves are enjoying full employment and are not as interested as they have been in the past in moving north of the border. So they don't like this idea of the wall. They certainly don't want to pay for it. But President Trump has said it'll be a complicated form, that there'll be some kind of way that the Mexican government will be made to pay for the cost of the wall or eat its costs. And one of the things that the president ordered in his executive order that he signed here in Washington yesterday is he's calling for a full accounting of all the government money that has gone from the United States to Mexico across all the federal agencies over the last 5 years. And perhaps what President Trump will threaten to do is cut off that funding and then say, see, here's the savings, and apply it to the cost of the wall.
You know, Steve, at one point, the president brought up the idea of remittances and somehow managing or stopping or halting people sending money to Mexico. I don't think I've heard that recently, but how realistic would that be?
Well, you know, one of the things we heard from the campaign more than a year ago was the idea that the president might try to use his ability under either the Patriot Act or some kind of other provision that governs financial transactions to seize or maybe even tax some of those remittances. I'm not sure on the particulars, but I gather that the president's power under that would be rather limited, that he'd have to go to Congress. So far, what Congress is saying is that the wall that they're going to build on the southern border was authorized by Congress in 2006 and signed by George W. Bush, and finally now Congress will pay for it. What remains to be seen is whether it's going to be an emergency supplemental, that's the kind of bill that does not require offsets, that is cuts elsewhere in the budget, or whether the Republicans will seek some kind of cuts, or whether they'll be satisfied just to get it done as a matter of national security. And that seems to be where the wind is blowing.
Stephen, stand by. I want to bring back Mark Rosenker, who's a former NTSB chairman. He's also joining us on the telephone. Let's talk a little bit about Air Force One, Mark. I've been on Donald Trump's 757. The president took me on a tour of it just a few months before he announced that he was going to run for president of the United States. It is tricked out. It is a legit mogul's plane. I've never been on Air Force One, so give us a sense of what the arrangements are like there. I know the press travels. They have a sort of area there. What is on Air Force One?
This is a great ride, Vlad, and you need to get a chance to ride in that particular airplane. I think you'll enjoy it very much. This airplane is 27 years old. It was delivered to President George H.W. Bush when he assumed the presidency in 1990. It was designed by the Reagan administration, and it took 5 years to design and build and test and then finally deploy and bring into the operations for Air Force One. Tail number would be 28000 or 29000. Those are the two tail numbers of the two 747s that have the radio call sign when the president is aboard as Air Force One. When the president is not aboard, it's called Special Air Missions and the tail number, 28000 or 29000. Aircraft right now looks like it is on its takeoff roll. getting ready to be airborne and taking the President of the United States to Philadelphia, his first ride on Air Force One.
You know, when the president was the president-elect, he tweeted out a concern or complaint about the cost of the new fleet of Air Force Ones. There was a contract with Boeing, and he tweeted out, $4 billion is way too much. Cancel the order. When you heard that price tag, $4 billion, did you think it seemed sort of high, or are there all sorts of things on these planes that we have no idea about that could bring the cost that high?
This is a very specialized aircraft. It is designed to actually have the White House in the air. It is capable of aerial refueling. It is capable of operating even during nuclear blasts. It is a very, very special aircraft that has defensive devices on board which are highly classified, highly sophisticated. It enables the president to be able to fly anywhere in the world safely, reliably.
All right, Mark Rosenker, as always, and Steve Portnoy, we thank you both.